Greetings and welcome. This video is brought to you by Upstate New York Freethinkers, a chapter of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, from the setting of the Eastern Communications Association 2025 conference in Buffalo, New York. The following discussion fits perfectly within the conference theme: Contemporary Problems, Creative Solutions. This discussion is a collaboration between the Eastern Communication Association, Baruch College, the University of Pittsburgh, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and Upstate New York Freethinkers. Today's discussion is titled Defending the Establishment Clause, the Past, Present, and Future of the Separation of Church and State. Our first speaker is David C. Hoffman. From Baruch College, he is the author of American Freethought, The History of a Social Movement, 1794 to 1948. This comprehensive book uncovers the rich history of American Freethought, exploring the people, movements, and ideas that challenged religious authority and championed reason. By understanding this vital history, we can better defend the future of reason and secularism. This discussion explores the history of American Freethought and its relevance to today's debates on the separation of church and state. You can find more information and extensive resources at unyft.org/American Freethought.
Welcome, everyone, to the Eastern Communication Association Convention and our panel on the Establishment Clause. The panelists today are myself, David Hoffman. I'm a professor at Baruch College and as part of the City University of New York. Patrick Hughes is from the University of Pittsburgh and a Thomas Paine scholar. I'm sure all of you know Annie Laurie Gaylor, who is co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and Madeline Hatcher is a graduate student at Baruch College. Here's my opening statement. The United States was founded on the principle of government religious neutrality at the federal level, a principle that also came to be observed by state and local governments. This principle is articulated in the Establishment and Free Exercise clauses of the First Amendment, which read, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." These are the very first words of the First Amendment. As interpreted by Justice Hugo Black in his 1947 Everson versus Board of Education decision, they mean that, quote, "neither a state nor the federal government can set up a church. Neither can pass laws which aid one religion, aid all religions, or prefer one religion over another. Neither can force nor influence a person to go to or to remain away from church against his will, or force him to profess a belief or disbelief in any religion. No person can be punished for entertaining or professing religious beliefs or disbeliefs, for church attendance or non-church attendance. No tax in any amount, large or small, can be levied to support any religious activities or institutions, whatever they may be called or whatever form they may adopt to teach or practice religion," unquote. The principle of government religious neutrality is intended to ensure citizens' individual rights of conscience and to maintain harmony between religious groups by ensuring that the government plays the role of a neutral referee in religious matters. But this principle today is coming under increasing attack from Christian nationalists who seek to establish a privileged place for the Christian religion in American life and law. This goal is stated explicitly in the platform of the Christian Liberty Party. Quote, "As worshipers of the one true God, we boldly proclaim God's lordship over politics. He alone is the sovereign of all things. His word is truth, and to Jesus Christ has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. This is truly the foundation of political liberty," unquote. About 20% of Americans fit the definition of Christian nationalists that is offered by social scientists Andrew L. Whitehead and Samuel L. Perry in their recent book, Taking America Back for God. Christian nationalists are an active and emboldened minority in American politics with enough electoral weight to swing elections. It strikes me that many of those who are working against the separation of church and state have not carefully considered the practical implications of what they are trying to achieve. Let us try to imagine a future where the United States has officially endorsed Christianity and awarded a privileged status to Christians in civic life. Would the people of the United States be happier or better off? Would the country's many different religious groups live in greater harmony than they do today? I submit that it would be just the opposite. The approximately 117 million people in the country who do not consider themselves to be Christians, people who serve their country in the military, as first responders, in healthcare and teaching professions, through science and engineering, and in many other ways, this third of the national population would have cause to be resentful. It would be a kind of disenfranchisement that Americans non-Christians would have done nothing to deserve. Under these conditions, would Christians live in greater harmony among themselves than before? Or would different Christian groups begin squabbling about which among them was truly worthy of whatever privileges had been granted and which were not sufficiently Christian to merit Christian privilege? And what advantage would the nation have given by traveling down this road of divisiveness and resentment? I can't think of any that would justify turning the country into yet one more place in the world that is ever on the brink of religious sectarian violence. And I'll wrap my statement up there. Go ahead, Annie Laurie.
Many of you probably know, maybe you don't, the origin story of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. My mother was an early abortion rights activist in the state of Wisconsin. And when I was in middle school, I followed her around the state. She was also on the national board of NARAL, working nationally, but she did a lot of educating in the state of Wisconsin for the right of contraception, which was, we were the last state in the union to allow unmarried people access to indecent articles, the Comstock Act kind of language, and also agitating for the right to abortion. And it became very clear to us as from everything that all the audience questions, when we would go into the Capitol, the Wisconsin State Capitol, we would see the bussed-in parochial school children, the nuns and the priests. All of their statements would say, the Bible says, God says, abortion is murder. It became very clear to us that religion should have nothing to do with our civil laws, and that it was ruling them when it came to women's rights. And it could have been something else that opened our eyes to the dangers of religion and government, but it was that experience. And unfortunately, we in this country are still facing this reproductive rights battle with this religious war against abortion rights. In terms of the importance of separation of church and state, I like to read a decision that came down by the Wisconsin State Supreme Court in 1890. And we'll be talking a little bit about the controversies about having Bibles in the schools, I think, later today. But this was a battle that was primarily being fought by Catholic people because they were encountering the use of the Protestant version. They were a minority at that time. The Protestant version of the Bible was being used in the schools. And in Wisconsin, there was a famous case taken by Catholics in the town of Edgerton against Bibles in the schools by Catholic parents, which was won by them. And it was, I think it was a unanimous or near unanimous decision by the Wisconsin State Supreme Court. It was called Weiss versus District Board. And there's this ringing language from a concurring decision in that I think is so eloquent and so important to remember. And it goes like this. There is no such source and cause of strife, quarrel, fights, malignant opposition, persecution, and war, and all evil in the state as religion. Let it once enter our civil affairs, our government would soon be destroyed. Let it once enter our common schools, they would be destroyed. Now, this was more than 70 years before we had the first Supreme Court rulings against Bible reading in the schools, but this was going on at the state level in several other states. And I think this is something that should be emblazoned everywhere in public buildings. It's so true. At the Freedom from Religion Foundation, we know that the founders of our nation were first among nations to deliberately and purposefully adopt a godless, entirely secular constitution whose only references to religion are exclusionary, such as that there should be no religious test for public office. The oath of office for the president is given. There is no reference to putting your hand on a Bible or saying, "So help me God." This was deliberate. I think most important in the preamble, the sovereignty was not given to a deity, but to we, the people. And then, of course, the First Amendment, the Bill of Rights was adopted. I wish the language that James Madison had originally suggested, which was a little clearer than what is in the First Amendment, was adopted. It was something about freedom of conscience, and the government should not be making laws about religion, but we have the wording, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And that eventually was also applied to state citizens. And this is something that we should be proud of in the United States, that has prevented so much divisiveness, all the bloodshed and warfare that the framers of our Constitution were aware of from the old country, and that persisted in so many of the colonies in the new country. But today we are fighting, as David said, we are fighting a battle against Christian nationalism. And just to give you one example of how extreme it's getting, we saw a third state legislature seat introduced into the legislature a resolution declaring Jesus Christ King of their state. This is Oklahoma. The first one came up in North Dakota, and it died a deserved death. Copycat bill was introduced in Montana, and now we see one in Oklahoma. And the ridiculousness of this. We were the country that threw out the monarch, and here they are saying that Jesus is king of the Oklahoma, and then the particular resolution says, but it doesn't mean that we don't have separation of church and state. I mean, it was just patently absurd. And of course, in Oklahoma, we have 24 at least percent of the population has no religion, 2% have other religions. Overall, we see 29% of the U.S. population is atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular, religiously unaffiliated. That makes us the largest single group by religious identification. If you look at denominations, there are more nuns, N-O-N-E-S, than there are Catholics. Catholics have gone down to 19%. There are more nuns than there are white Christian evangelicals, who are at 24%. So my mantra is that the non-religious among us are swing voters. We could be countering the effect of the white Christian nationalists. And what we need to do is get the younger Gen Zs out there to vote, because our secular values need to prevail. And that's what we work for at the Freedom from Religion Foundation.
Thank you. Patrick.
Yep, thanks. So Patrick Hughes from the University of Pittsburgh. I teach occasionally in the Department of Religious Studies at Pitt. And I mean, just picking up on some things, right? Religious diversity it's a matter of fact. It's an on-the-ground fact in the United States. And it has been since the colonial period, right? If you consider that Methodists are not the same as Quakers, are not the same as Baptists, are not the same as Congregationalists, are not the same as Anglicans, right? Not the same as Jews. There were some Jews back in the colonial period as well, right? So they were sort of more the outliers. And that diversity has just only been growing. It's only been getting more diverse, right? Democracy, it's a glorious mess, right? And it's supposed to be that way. It's not supposed to be top-driven. It's supposed to be ground up. And so putting any kind of established religion becomes immediately coercive, right? Because you have the political power behind a set of beliefs or dogma that probably the vast majority of the people in your country hold no truck with, right? So I mean, just right there, just on the ground, the diversity itself should sort of be a big warning that you're not going to get on board with this. Christians don't agree with themselves, right? Obviously. I often ask when I teach religious studies, American religious history in my classes, I usually start the semesters asking my students to say, okay, how many Christians do I have here? You know, how many Protestants? Okay, how many Muslims? Any Jews? Yes. Catholics, Orthodox? I sort of run. All right, who doesn't have any religious affiliation? Who have I not mentioned? Occasionally we get like a Mormon or someone, you know, in the class. And I say, is it a problem for any of you that if you're a Christian, you have Jewish friends? Is it a problem that you have Muslim friends? And the looks that I get are like, no, what are you even talking about, right? I've never had a student say, well, they probably wouldn't anyway, say like, yeah, it's a big problem if I have a Jewish friend because I'm a Christian and we can't be friends with Jews or Muslims or Mormons or Orthodox or whatever, right? Problem that any of your friends are atheists, right? That's not how we divide ourselves in the US, right? We're divided enough on politics, and I always say to my students, okay, my dad's from Northern Ireland. Now there's a huge divide there, right? Between Catholic and Protestant. Both Christian groups, but there's a huge divide, and that looms large in my thinking all the time. Religion divides a lot of the world within societies. I also like to think, as a historian of American religion, I think, you know, disestablishment and freedom of religion has actually made religion stronger. I think that's why it's flourished in the US. We're sort of an outlier among all sort of the modern industrialized nations in terms of the high religious affiliation that we have. And I think that does go back to the diversity, but also to this idea that, you know, there is no established religion, and we're free to worship and join whatever church, or create a church of our own and go down the street and open up a storefront and have our own church, or mosque, or synagogue, or whatever you want to call it, meeting house, right? And if you get people to come to it and donate to you, voila, you're a new religion. And there's no state the state can't move in and say you can't do that. But if you establish a church or any kind of religious body, they can step in and squash that. So I think it's been good for religion in the US, and I think that the folks who are on the other side need to remember that the reason that they're allowed to exist is because of this disestablishment. So.
Thank you, Patrick. Madeline.
Hello, on the end here. Personally, I'm from North Carolina. I saw the UNCW tote bag. I'm from Wilmington, so I clocked that. And growing up, you know, spending the majority of my child and, you know, teen years and then, you know, all through college in that area, I think was really enlightening. And the way that the politics are so infused with religion there, specifically Christianity. And I think that the clearest example I can think of is the church that I went to growing up, mostly because I think that my parents just kind of wanted to like dump the kids off for a few hours for like youth group, which is fair. We weren't like super religious, but they were like, go to youth group, and I was like, okay, there's pizza. Works like a charm. You know, I had a great time. You know, I probably would have called myself decently religious growing up, but really was just kind of there for the vibes. And later on, after we'd kind of left the area, I'd moved to New York City. That church, there was this big division within the Methodist Church, and that church was one of the ones that like publicly did this whole thing against the LGBTQ community. And I just remember being so shocked that all these people that I had, all these worship leaders, these people that I had like looked up to as a kid, and you know, my parents had trusted me with, and you know, thought that was like a good person, you know, just really were on this terrible side of history. I think that was very eye-opening for me. So kind of as I've grown, you know, and lived in different areas throughout the country and different communities, I've kind of come to the conclusion that giving any religion any implicit or explicit elevation in our political sphere and any part of the government sets a dangerous precedent for policy making and legislation that affects all of us, right? Not just that one community. And we all have seen, of course, in recent years, weaponizing Christianity under the guise of religious freedom to promote the conservative agenda, which science, obviously, and equality are not centered. So I feel like this inherently leads to a creation of another group if you're not part of that first group. And that directly goes against the ideals the country is founded upon. And just leave you with, how can we all be created equal if some of us are holier than them?
Thank you, Madeline. And we'll start back in the American Revolution. all of the southern states and metropolitan New York during in the Revolutionary period had the Church of England as their established church. And an established church is given official support by the state. There's mandatory tithes that are collected to support the church buildings and the clergy. There's different levels of establishment. At its height in England, not only were there civil penalties for not being a member of the Church of England, there were criminal penalties for meeting, in worship contexts that were not Church of England related. So not only were Catholics out, but also dissenting Protestants were out too. Well, so the Church of England, whenever you're at war with England, you can't have the Church of England as the established church of your state. It's just like a security concern that your clergy are reporting to the Bishop of Canterbury, who reports to the King of England. So in a very short period of time during the Revolution, all those Anglican establishments were done away with, and many states added freedom of religion protections to their constitutions. The holdouts were in New England, where the Congregational Church was established, and those establishments went on through the Revolution because the Congregationalists weren't viewed as the same kind of security threat as the Anglicans were. The next moment that we're moving forward to is the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. This was actually a reaction. In 1784, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson fought off an attempt by Patrick Henry to restore state support in a more generalized way to teachers of the Christian religion in Virginia. In 1786, they ensured that it would never happen again by enacting the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, a bill authored by Jefferson. This was one of the three accomplishments that he mentions on his gravestone. He mentions being author of the Declaration, founding the University of Virginia, and this religious protection in Virginia. And so these words became law. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. However, at the time, this applied only to the federal government. A large part of the motivation for the First Amendment was because people in states, especially the states that already had established religions, didn't want any other religion to get a national establishment. They wanted to protect more or less like states' rights in religion. And so, many of the founders were deists, but it wasn't only the deists and the freethinkers who were for this. The people of many different religions had a really important reason to not want a national establishment. So as I mentioned, the national establishments continued in three states in New England. Some of the early opponents of that were Baptists who have always been for, or at least have classically been for, separation of church and state. On New Year's Day, 1802, President Jefferson presented a letter to John Leland voicing his support for this Baptist attempts to disestablish the Congregational Church in Connecticut. This letter contains the words that were made famous by Hugo Black's decision, a high wall of separation between church and state. In gratitude for Jefferson's support, John Leland carted a 1,235-pound wheel of cheese all the way from Connecticut to Washington, D.C. To give to Jefferson as a president. This is a memorial of that wheel of cheese. It has been contended by some people that the Baptists did not appreciate Jefferson's stand on this issue. I don't see how you can give a guy a 1,200-pound wheel of cheese under any conditions other than appreciating what the person has done. Massachusetts became the last state to disestablish its state religion in 1833, so it took quite a few more years of effort. It was in that same year, perhaps by coincidence, perhaps not, that Supreme Court, that should be Court Justice Joseph Story, tried to stop the progress of church-state separation with his commentaries on the Constitution of the United States. I'm going to read at length from this. Keep in mind, this is after the founding generation. This is the next generation when the backlash begins to set in against the progress of separation of church and state. So here's Joseph Story's words. Probably at the time of the adoption of the Constitution and the amendment to it now under consideration, the general, if not the universal sentiment in America was that Christianity ought to receive encouragement from the state. An attempt to level all religions and to make it a matter of state policy to hold all in utter indifference would have created universal disapprobation, if not universal indignation. The real object of the amendment was not to countenance, much less to advance Mohammedanism or Judaism or infidelity by prostrating Christianity, but to exclude all rivalry among Christian sects and to prevent any national ecclesiastical establishment which should give rise to a hierarchy, the exclusive patronage of the national government. So once again, this is his own textually unsupported interpretation of what he feels was going through the founding fathers' minds. This interpretation of history is strongly, however, contradicted by something that Thomas Jefferson writes about in his autobiography, his 1821 autobiography, whenever he writes about a failed attempt to amend the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. Jefferson says, where the preamble declares that coercion is, quote, a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion, unquote, an amendment was proposed by inserting the word Jesus Christ, to see what's happening even back then, so that it should read a departure from the plan of Jesus Christ, comma, the holy author of our religion. The insertion was rejected by the great majority in proof that they meant to comprehend within the mantle of its protection the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and the Mohammedan, the Hindu, the infidel of every denomination. So Jefferson, and he feels, his fellow legislators in Virginia did have this very pluralistic view of, what protection of religious freedom meant. Story's interpretation of the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause, though, is one of the things that gave rise to a constitutional philosophy or a way of enforcing the Establishment Clause called non-denominationalism, which meant basically what Story said, that the government shouldn't favor any one particular sect, but could do things that would be favorable to all religions. And that worked pretty well as long as America was a Protestant majority country. When Catholics began arriving in great numbers, and this has already been alluded to by Annie Laurie, in the 1840s, problems began, though, because public schools at that time under non-denominationalism were non-denominationally Protestant, and they had the full support of the government as being non-denominationally Protestant. Catholics complained that they needed to read the King James translation of the Bible. Many of the Catholics were refugees from Ireland, where they had lived under oppressive conditions. And this gave rise to violence. In 1844, what's commonly referred to as the Bible Riots broke out in Philadelphia, and it was mostly nativist Protestant know-nothings attacking the Catholic neighborhood of Kensington in Philadelphia, burning about 30 Catholic homes because the Catholics had protested that they needed to read this version of the Bible that they didn't want to read, and a number of people, including an 8-year-old child, were killed. In my mind, this is the beginning of the wind down of the non-denominationalist interpretation. It's after this point that on the local level, through the 1890s, as Annie Laurie mentioned, that school boards begin to see, well, maybe we shouldn't have the Bible in the school at all if it's going to cause this much trouble. It's just too divisive. So that's another important turning point. Let's moved to after the Civil War, when a group called the National Reform Association led what I think is the first attempt to add a Christian amendment to the American Constitution. And this attempt to add a Christian amendment motivated radical Unitarian Francis Ellingwood Abbott to pen the 9 demands of liberalism. And this basically manifesto that rejected government religious involvement in any form sort of turned this movement of freethinkers who had been at that point mostly satisfied with finding fellow travelers and sort of spreading the idea that Christian doctrines were absurd in a lot of cases. This turned them very strongly towards concentrating their energies on church-state issues. And we can review the 9 demands of liberalism at the end if we have time. Again, fast forward 75 years into the future. After 75 years of campaigning, freethinkers and other defenders of the separation of church and state got a Supreme Court ruling in their favor in a matter of school busing in the case of Everson versus the Board of Education. And this is the beginning of the modern era of church-state separation. At that point, the Supreme Court was going through a process that it called the incorporation of the Bill of Rights into state law. Up to that point, the state laws didn't need to conform to what's talked about in the Bill of Rights, but this court felt that the 14th Amendment passed after the Civil War with its due process clause gave them leave to say, states, you need to live up to the Bill of Rights in your local laws as well. And the first time that was clearly spelled out what that meant for religion was in this 1947 case. And that is where I will leave the story and pass it on to the other panelists.
So I inadvertently duplicated David's work by choosing the Philadelphia Bible Riots as a key moment. So I won't say much more about that, except that I think that it was also so unfortunate because it gave the Catholic bishops more ammunition to demand their right to public-supported Catholic parochial education. And I do want to say something about what's going on in the present. You may be aware that there's a case before the U.S. Supreme Court out of Oklahoma on a bill that FFRF opposed, and we actually had a separate lawsuit, but it was sued over by the Attorney General there. It's to create virtual schools. And the reason that they're doing this is that many voucher proposals are unpopular because most state constitutions say that public education has to be uniform, and most rural areas do not have private schools. They do not have parochial schools, and this is helping to defeat voucher money. And so Notre Dame Law Clinic got together with the Oklahoma Diocese and Archdiocese in Tulsa and Oklahoma City, and they came up with this scheme to create virtual charter schools, online schools, that would teach Catholicism. And a committee, it wasn't voted on by the legislature, but the committee that made the decision in Oklahoma approved this. And as I said, Attorney General Drummond, who's a Republican, understands why this is a violation, took it to got it up to the Oklahoma State Supreme Court. We in a coalition went into federal court in the meantime, and our case is in limbo. The Supreme Court ruled in his favor, and he appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and surprise, surprise, they took it. So I think that if this case wins, it's going to be unstoppable in terms of money going to religious schools. It won't just be Catholic, but they'll set these up everywhere, and that will get around these state prohibitions on uniformity. So it's a very serious, serious case that's before the Supreme Court. We're doing an amicus brief on it. But, the Catholic bishops have been determined to get public funding for their religious schools, and they're going to get it. At least this is going to, it's a very, very concerning situation that will lead to the downfall of funding of our public schools. And, public schools are the bedrock of our democracy. So then I guess I will just take off where David left off, he talked about the first case to incorporate the First Amendment, saying that citizens have First Amendment rights, that the government should not, state government should not be establishing religion. And so that paved the way for the McCullum case, and I think many of you are familiar with the McCullum family, Vashti McCullum in the 1940s, who realized that they had religious instruction classes in the public schools, and her little boy was the only one not taking it. And when he was not taking it, he was treated like a pariah, beaten up on the way to and from school. He was told to sit in the hall while these religious instruction classes were going on, which is what they did with kids in detention. She knew that wasn't right. She sued, she lost the appeal, and then they took it to the U.S. Supreme Court, and she won 8-1, a very landmark decision against religious instruction in the public schools. And in that case, the Supreme Court said, "The public school is at once the symbol of our democracy and the most pervasive means for promoting our common destiny. In no activity of the state is it more vital to keep out divisive forces than in its schools, to avoid confusing, not to say fusing, what the Constitution sought to keep strictly apart." Quote, "The great American principle of eternal separation," unquote. Elihu Root's phrase bears repetition. This is the Supreme Court speaking, "is one of the vital reliances of our constitutional system for assuring unities among our people stronger than our diversities. It is the court's duty to enforce this principle in its full integrity." So this case came down in 1948, and then in the early 60s, we saw the beginning of a series of cases against prayer and Bible reading in the public schools. These cases also, in the 90s, we had a strong case against prayer at graduation ceremonies. In the year 2000, we had a follow-up case saying that you could not say prayer over the intercom during football games, even if it was student-led. All of these cases are severely jeopardized, and you probably know about the Bremerton decision from a couple years ago in the state of Washington, where the Supreme Court said that this coach could go and pray on the outfield after games. The only thing that was saving us from this is that there was a false narrative entered into the Supreme Court record, and they reiterated that he wasn't involving students. That was untrue. He had been involving students for many years, but at least they didn't actually overturn the other decisions on prayer in schools. But we're holding our breath on when that will happen.
Thank you. Go ahead, Patrick.
All right, I got two things. One is a positive one. One is sort of I'm arguing from absence. So I think the First Amendment gets too much play. It's like taking all the glory, right? It's just like, the beautiful thing that everyone loves. How about Article 6, the no test case? Let's remember that, right? It's in the body of the Constitution. It's not one of these tack-on amendments, right? Like the First Amendment. It's the First Amendment, but it's still tacked on. So, right, Article 6 is, "But no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States," right? That's super important, right? And I think the First Amendment gets all the glory, but this is sort of pretty monumental right there, right? Because it got rid of an extremely high hurdle that had been on the books in basically every colony. And so when there's, you're a Quaker, you can't hold office. You can't even be a judge. You can't be any kind of public office. You can't do it because you're a Quaker, or you're the wrong kind of Christian, or you're just not one of us, right? So saying right up front, we're not going down that road is important. And it comes as the very last article in the Constitution. Article 7 basically says, here's what we need to ratify this Constitution. So all the nuts and bolts are up through Article 6. Article 7 is just, we need 9 of the states to sort of ratify it. So it's not really doing anything about setting up the government and how it works. It's just saying, how is this document going to actually be brought into force? And so it's the last thing in this document. And why is that important for me? I think it's because it's saying, basically, everything we've been talking about since the preamble and we the people, we're not going to exclude anybody because of their religious beliefs or their religious affiliation. okay, now how do we ratify this thing, right? And so it's a nice coda to the end of this document that says, these are the qualifications. Now the president has qualifications. Here's what we're not going to have as a qualification. So Article 6, I think, remember it fondly, even though the First Amendment gets all the glory. Don't forget, good old Article 6. All right. So the other thing I want to this sort of case from an absence is Thomas Paine's book, The Age of Reason. Anyone read this book? Published in the 1790s, right? Thomas Paine, sort of famous for Rights of Man in the French Revolution, famous even more in the US for Common Sense. Well, he writes in 1794, when he's in France, this book, The Age of Reason, which one scholar has called a blast of deistic dynamite, right? He's the arch deist, the arch infidel, there's a lot of names he's called, arch this and that. So it's never prosecuted for blasphemy. And it seems like such a low-hanging fruit that it could have been or it should have been, right? His detractors, my dissertation was on people who responded to it, mostly against, a couple who were supportive. His opponents, they were breathlessly fulminating against this book. They brought everything to bear against it, against Paine himself, against the French, against his arguments, against the way he wrote. Everything they brought sort of against him and his book, The Age of Reason, which was widely popular in the US and in England. Supposedly everyone was reading it, talking about it. It sort of had a little sort of moment where everyone sort of conceited themselves as a deist, just like Paine, which made Christian ministers completely crazy about this. But no publishers or booksellers in the United States were charged with blasphemy. It didn't stop a whole bunch of people writing against it. There's one guy who goes by the anonymous, it's called the Delaware Wagoner. And he's writing like a common man because he wants to appeal to the common man, like Thomas Paine did, which was the big worry. The Delaware Wagoner, I'm just a simple wagon driver, but even I know that Thomas Paine is wrong, right? I mean, this is how mad this guy got. He said, I hope that in every city and every town in the United States, they set up an effigy of Thomas Paine so that everyone will have the opportunity to piss in his face. This is how down and dirty this guy was, right?
Every man.
Every man, most likely.
Typical.
Yes. So this is how ugly it got. They did not like him. Charges were thrown. Paine is blasphemous. He's completely irreverent. He should, be horsewhipped, that kind of stuff. And yet the book was never charged with blasphemy, and none of the publishers or printers. And I find that, I like to think that maybe they thought, like, if they did that, it would make it more popular, which is kind of hard because all these tracts and broadsides and pamphlets were coming out against Paine very specifically, which, again, made it more popular. So if you brought an indictment for blasphemy, okay, is it going to make it that more popular than it already is? Maybe not. I sort of like to think that maybe it's because, right, we're not that far out of this First Amendment, the Constitution. We're at the end of the Enlightenment. Maybe there's a sense that, all right, he can say what he wants about religion. We don't like it, and if I were to meet him in the street, I'd punch him in the face. However, he's not legally responsible for this. He should not be prosecuted using the force of the state to do that, right? So, I'm not sure that's what's going on here. It certainly was not the case in England, right? In England, in the 1790s, Paine's publisher, Thomas Williams, in 1797, who was a publisher, was tried for blasphemy and was charged with blasphemy and was convicted, and I think he served about a year in jail for blasphemy. A few years later, a guy named Daniel Isaac Eaton, in 1811, was also charged with blasphemy and also served jail time for publishing The Age of Reason, the third part of The Age of Reason. So in England, which has an established church, right, blasphemy legislation was used to basically make The Age of Reason illegal. And selling it could get you into trouble, and writing about it could get you into trouble. But in the United States, it didn't happen. And so I think maybe there's a general sense that religious topics, well, the stakes are high. Paine has a right to publish his ideas about religion, even if you don't like it and you want to punch him in the face or set up an effigy and piss in his face. We're not going to use the state to come after him for this. So, sort of a absence example of absence, which makes me feel a little bit good about the 1790s. So.
Thank you for that optimistic interpretation of history.
Yeah.
Madeline.
Yeah. So there's this case that I found really interesting, Carson versus Macon, I don't know, from 2022, which, going back to Annie Laurie's kind of comments on school vouchers, this is related to that. It found that families in Maine could use the school vouchers, which are funded by the state government, to attend religious schools, kind of after some contentious debates. And at that point, my line on that is, I think it's fine to send your child to a religious school if that's your choice. Sure, fine. But I don't think it should be at the expense of the state dollars. And unsurprisingly, I was like, oh, let me just do a quick Google search. Let me see, maybe there's a bunch of different religious schools, and this is, maybe there's enough for all the religions, and that's what they're talking about. No, it's largely Christian schools that you can find in Maine, at least the high schools that I looked at. So it's essentially saying that it's fine to use state government dollars to send children to Christian schools. And kind of as I was looking into that, I found a kind of ongoing suit where from actually just a couple months ago in January, 2 religious schools from Maine argued in federal court against the state's anti-discrimination law, already not off to a good start, because they said that would infringe on their constitutional right to free exercise of religion. Again, you're like, if you're fighting against anti-discrimination, this can't be good. Bangor Christian Schools has a practice of not admitting gay or trans students, expelling students for premarital sex. St. Dominic's Academy, students are expected to pray 3 times a day. They can be expelled if they don't agree to that. So that's kind of ongoing with that dispute, but I just thought it was really interesting that, from all of these 100 years of history, and even a couple months ago, we're still having this discussion, this debate about whether or not, what religious freedom really looks like, and whether that is for everyone or just people who are Christians.
Thank you, and that segues us very nicely to our next topic, which is thoughts on separation of church and state today. Annie Laurie has already talked about the Bremerton School District case. I have a slide. This is Coach Kennedy engaging in what the court called a private religious observance with the football players after a game. My one-word answer that I shared with everybody else to the state of church-state separations today was precarious. Let me elaborate. In 2022, in the case of Kennedy versus Bremerton School District, a conservative-leaning Supreme Court ruled that a football coach could pray on the field after an official school football game. In doing so, it abandoned the standard of the Lemon Test, which mandated that all government activities must have a secular purpose, and allowed that religious expression of government officials should be judged in the light of, quote, historical practices and circumstances, unquote. In the wake of this ruling, many states have passed laws that would clearly have been unconstitutional under the Lemon Test. For instance, very recently, in June 2024, Louisiana enacted a law requiring that the 10 Commandments be displayed in every classroom. Although this law has been blocked by a lower court in at least one school district, it is likely just the tip of the iceberg. Much of the country is vulnerable to Supreme Court reversals of cases involving religious tests for public office and blasphemy, not only because the protections granted by previous rulings have not been reaffirmed by state laws, but also because many states still have unrepealed religious test and blasphemy laws on their books, which will reactivate at the moment the Supreme Court reverses itself. Let me review some of these surviving religious test and blasphemy laws at the state level. I think of them somewhat as like unexploded ordnance that could go off under the right conditions. So in my home state of Pennsylvania, this is actually in the Constitution of the state. It would require a constitutional amendment to remove. It's a religious test law. No person who acknowledges the being of a God in a future state of rewards and punishment shall, on account of his religious sentiments, be disqualified to hold any office or place of trust or profit under this commonwealth. I love sort of the negative framing of this, because the implication is, well, here's who doesn't get disqualified. But you do get disqualified not only if you don't profess to believe in God, but also if you don't profess to believe in hell, which is the state of punishment after. So this law has been in the Pennsylvania Constitution for an extremely long time in some form. Other states that have religious test laws include, still on their books, Maryland, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Texas. Massachusetts has a lovely blasphemy law as part of its criminal code, which would reactivate Supreme Court rulings against blasphemy. And this is, look what blasphemy is here. Whoever willfully blasphemes the holy name of God by denying, cursing, or contemptuously reproaching God, his creation, government, or final judging of the world, or by cursing or contemptuously reproaching Jesus Christ or the Holy Ghost, or by cursing or contemptuously reproaching or exposing to contempt and ridicule the holy word of God contained in the Holy Scriptures, shall be punished by imprisonment in jail for not more than 1 year, or a fine of not more than $300, and may also be bound to good behavior. And so this law was reaffirmed in the 20th century by Massachusetts. Other states that still have blasphemy laws on their books include Maine and Oklahoma. And so precarious is the state of church-state separation today.
Well, I did want to say about the Bremerton decision. You saw him clearly praying with students, that the dissenters, and there were 3, I believe, not 4, did the remarkable thing of adding photos like that to their dissent. They wanted the facts to be out there, that this is what happened. And Sonia Sotomayor, in her dissent, basically said, I can't quote it from line for line, but she said it's getting to the point where the separation of state and church is considered a violation of the Establishment Clause. So we see, the uneven balance of the separation of church and state goes here, and so-called religious liberty goes here. That the idea that it's a violation of somebody's freedom of religion if somebody else has a different religion, or they're LGBTQ or whatever, that somehow you don't have to, if you're a Christian, you don't have to follow the same rules as everyone else, and allow them to be as they are. And I did want to say that the Freedom from Religion Foundation is one of the coalition that is suing over that 10 Commandments bill in Louisiana, which is so pernicious. The legislature said it had to be, I think it's 10 by 14 inches. It has to be a certain font. This is in the law. That it has to go in every classroom. I assume this is art class, gym class, from kindergarten through public college. And the idea, why would a kindergartner need to know thou shalt not commit adultery? And as we always say, the first commandment alone shows why it's a violation of the First Amendment to ever put the 10 Commandments in a public school or public building, because the government in the state of Louisiana has no right telling a captive audience of school children which gods to have, or how many gods to have, or whether to have any gods at all. And the Supreme Court, of course, has ruled in Stone versus Graham that it is unconstitutional, but the theocrats out there are hoping, of course, to get the Supreme Court, the new Supreme Court, to overturn that. But it is, undeniably sacred text according to the Supreme Court decision. The first 4 have nothing to do with morality. They only have to do with what God to worship and what will happen to you and your generations of descendants if you worship the wrong God. I also wanted to say that the Freedom from Religion Foundation has an action fund, a C4 arm now, and we recently hired a seated member of the state legislature. State Representative Mickey Dollins is now a staff member of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. He cannot work on Oklahoma legislation, but he has other areas, and he has coincidentally resolved that what we're going to try to do is get rid of some of these dormant, unconstitutional laws, the ones that David just showed you. And he was hoping to start with South Carolina, so he's working on that because they could come back to bite us. And then I did want to say that my word for the state of separation of church and state is that it is a perilous situation. We recently ran a full-page ad in the New York Times saying that our revered constitutional principle of separation between religion and government has never been under greater assault. And of course, that means that many individual liberties that are predicated on keeping religion out of government are also under assault, as we can see with the anti-trans executive orders, as we can see with the continuing threats to abortion rights, the Comstock Act, contraception. We have a president who says he was saved by God to make America great again and to make America pray again. The health secretary, the anti-vaxxer that he is, claims that God sent me President Trump. The attorney general has been tasked with overseeing Trump's phony eradicating anti-Christian bias executive order, and we have a very bad bill, federal universal voucher bill, being introduced in Congress that could help kill our public schools. And so it is kind of an onslaught, but I can talk later about a majority of Americans, of course, do not support many of these things. A majority of Americans do not support vouchers. We are working with a coalition of groups, and we are increasingly seeing Christians working against Christian nationalism. There's the group Christians Against Christian Nationalism that is run as a part of the arm of the Joint Baptist Committee of American Baptists. We see many books that are being authored by Christians, researchers who happen to be Christian. So there is a lot to be said about the, I hope, backlash against Christian nationalism.
Patrick.
All right, we've got precarious, we got perilous. I'm going to add one more P, which is polarizing. Right? I think that's sort of the present state. I think, as with much of political discourse today, it's very polarized. I think adding this religious layer is not helping the case. So I think it's definitely polarizing. I like the ticking time bombs of blasphemy legislation, I think I think that could definitely rear its head again. And I worry that, that's been it's sort of an easy thing to trot out every now and again, right? It's been used as a threat or actually as a actual indicting people for blasphemy. In the U.S., I think in Pennsylvania, the last time, I think it was in the 1970s, there was a person, it was dismissed out of court, basically laughed out of court, but someone was charged with blasphemy for hanging a poster of Jesus that says, wanted for, looking like a hippie or something like that.
Well, he does.
According
to Sunday school.
And so if there's that switch, then I think these time bombs could certainly, and could bring up a whole thing about, is the common law of England still in force in the United States, and blasphemy is part of the common law because Christianity is part of the common law and the foundation of the government of England. That's sort of standard sort of legal common law arguments from the English side. And did the American Revolution break that? That could also be popping up again, that common law violations. There may not even be statutory thing. You can be charged with blasphemy even though there's no statute against it in your state because Christianity is part of the common law because it was part of the English common law, and we are the inheritors of an English common law. So, and one other just sort of thing is at one point are the Christian nationalists going to get what they want, and then it's going to turn on them, right? I think, they want, generally, secularists were worried about the impact that religion has on the state, right? And I think the early folks like Roger Williams and the Baptist Isaac Backus they were somewhat concerned about that, but they were more concerned about the state's corruption of religion, right? These guys like Roger Williams, they weren't so worried about the state. They were worried about their souls, right? They were worried about what the state, which is a corrupt, necessary evil, is going to do to Christianity if it becomes coercive, right? And so I think if you open this gate, all right, now is the state going to be coming down with rulings that Christian nationalists don't like? Because again, they're not all agreeing with each other, right? So at what point are they opening the Pandora's box and they cannot close it again, and things are going to start coming out. And then all of a sudden they might be like, oh no, that separation was actually, that was pretty good. Yeah, maybe we need to have that back again because you just ruled in this against our favor by deciding which Christian group is actually the correct one, right? So, or having the state rule on doctrine and theology. So, they might get what they want, but it might turn on them. So,
Thank you.
That's sort of a
Very optimistic over here.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of a P word, but I can't. I wanted to keep it going.
We took all the good ones.
I know. That's good, because when I also could not think of just one word, because I was having a hard time, but I'm a very visual person, so when you were talking about the initial kind of quote that led it to be called separation between church and state with a wall, I was thinking that today it's like one of those little garden fences. Like, I don't know if anyone's grandparents have them. I feel like mine always did the little fence that was like this big and you could like walk around it. You were like, what is this doing? Like, it's just like decorative. You could climb over it. It wasn't really doing much. That's kind of how I feel like this wall has become a little fence. Kind of to everyone's point, religious institutions, especially Christian ones, continue to hold a strong sway over politics at every level. But I, do remain optimistic because the younger generations, with each new generation, we are, as a country, identifying less and less as religious and, saying that religion holds a sway over our personal politics and kind of day-to-day lives. So I think that as Congress continues to get older and maybe die off eventually, retire, I don't know, I have some hope that the younger generations, will maybe instill some change in the future, but it's to be seen.
I hope that too. And move on to positive developments in church-state separation. And my contribution here involves the rise or wannabe rise of humanist chaplains, both in public institutions. James Madison, in documents that were only unearthed in the 1940s, we discovered that the primary author of the First Amendment thought that congressional chaplains were unconstitutional, but that view did not prevail within Congress or within the Supreme Court at that time, and it hasn't since. And it's in the 9 demands of liberalism that there should be no publicly supported chaplains of any kind, but that approach hasn't really flown, and if it didn't fly in the 1970s, it's probably not going to fly now. An alternate approach to solving that constitutional dilemma is to at least give atheists and humanists equal representation in chaplaincies. And there's been pushes to do this in the military and in other public institutions. And so this is a flyer about a presentation at Harvard Divinity School about military chaplains. You might get the impression from this poster that all humanist chaplains are male, but that's not the case. This is and there's a picture and the title of an NPR story about Vanessa Zoltan. And as I was putting this together, I had this case in the back of my mind. I couldn't remember exactly where it came from, but I remembered that somebody was suing over the fact, a humanist chaplain was suing over the fact that they had been barred from giving a guest prayer at Congress. And then I looked it up and I discovered that what I was remembering was actually the co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, Dan Barker. And so it's, there's still some way to go, but I think this is a promising approach, but I'm sure that Annie Laurie can say more about this.
Yeah, unfortunately, that case is dead, but the People's House does not have room for a non-religious invocation at this time. The chaplains have all the power, and they don't want to let him give an invocation, even though he has submitted one that was really very tactful. And he had to jump through all these hoops that nobody else has to. And he has an ordination, because he's a former minister. He met the criteria, but we weren't able to have that happen. We will keep trying. So for my little homily about hope, I want to reiterate that, as I started to say, a majority of citizens, according to most polls, oppose vouchers, which is a huge threat to our public schools. They oppose using tax dollars to pay for religious education. And we have seen that when this comes up for a vote, it is always defeated. Voters in 3 states last fall rejected vouchers. Those states were hardly, secular strongholds. Kentucky, Nebraska, which actually repealed a program that had been adopted, and Colorado. And way back in 1967, 72% of New York voters refused one of the first such ballot initiatives. 72%. Michigan and Nebraska refused in 1970, and then again Michigan in 2000, California in 2000, Utah in 2007, Florida in 2012, and Oklahoma, yes, Oklahoma in 2016, and that's something that Mickey Dolenz, our the state representative, is very proud of. So unfortunately, the Supreme Court has opened the door to vouchers, and we are waiting on that ruling on the constitutionality of the virtual charter school, which could have devastating consequences. But the voters, the people, the American people, do reject vouchers. They get it, and that is very positive.
I guess I'll sort of end where I sort of began with the religious diversity of the United States. And it's been a positive diversity, and it continues becoming more diverse. And I think, as Annie Laurie sort of mentioned earlier, this rise of the nones, N-O-N-E-S, right? Those who don't have any affiliation with any particular religious group. I think that might be a good trend that has to only serve to counteract this sort of sneaky wedding of any kind of church and state. I think folks that don't hold truck with any belief, any system, any dogma, any doctrine. Again, are they all atheists and agnostics? No, they're just unaffiliated, which historically, before the American Revolution, most people were unaffiliated themselves. So we always see these, the clergy are always crying about how the American people are an irreligious lot. It took the First Great Awakening in the 1740s to sort of inject a little bit of Christianity into the American populace. Certainly the Second Great Awakening in the early part of the 19th century is when America really got this sense that we were somehow this great Christian nation, which is before that it was, most people couldn't be bothered to go to church unless they were forced to or somehow coerced into doing so. So not to say they didn't consider themselves nominally Christian, but they generally were not the pious sort of people that Christian nationalists think that they were. So I think this rise of the nones, these unaffiliated people, I think that's a nice religious diversity that has been lacking, but I think it's growing, and I think that can only sort of serve to counteract the narrative.
We don't use the term deism anymore, but I sometimes wonder how many of the nuns might actually be described as something that's the modern equivalent of deists. There might be more deists in the country now than there were in the Revolutionary period. Given the rise of population, it's a pretty sure thing.
Yeah, well, the sociologist Robert Bella sort of wrote about this, God, I think it was in the 1980s or something. He called them people who consider themselves spiritual but not religious, mm-hmm. right? They sort of, and he talks about the cafeteria brand of American religiosity, where you sort of go through the line, you pick a little bit from here, you maybe take a little bit of Methodism, you like the Catholics how they have the art, but you like Buddhism because sort of this cafeteria approach, which a lot of people I think in the U.S. today have this cafeteria approach. They're spiritual but not religious because religious sort of locks you into this sort of very sort of narrow view. But the American, we have such diversity, the American cafeteria approach, I know Catholics who do yoga and that's not a problem, or they are practicing Buddhists, they meditate, right? So it's not necessarily a problem, whereas the church hierarchy may be like, a bit more hinky about that. And some Protestant ministers might certainly be opposed to things like doing yoga in school. There's cases out there about having yoga in the public schools. And
that is every much a part of our religious freedom in the United States, as some of the other things that have been defended using the free exercise clause. We will give Madeline the final word.
Yeah, well, just echoing what everyone else has said, there is some positive trends. Pew Research from 2021 found that 54% of people surveyed, a little over half, barely, but a little, said that the federal government should enforce separation of church and state, so I find that encouraging. It's not a strong majority, but it's better than it has been. And I think it shows that the majority of the people want separation between church and state. And so we just need to really work to take back power from the church and give it to the people so we can have we the people again.
Thanks. We're at the end of our time, but if we're lucky, the next group won't kick us out for another 5 minutes or so. So we might have time for a few questions. They're still clapping in the other room, so I think we're good. Yeah, they really like the word perilous, by the way.
They clap for that one.
Next question regarding the nuns and their religious affiliation. Is there any studies coordinating somebody's self-described lack of religion with their political apathy or non-apathy?
PRRI it looks into it. And I don't have it right in front of me, but the nuns tend to be Democrat or independent. And that would be true for the members of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. There are very few Republican nuns. There are some. And the white Christian nationalists are almost all Republican. So they have looked at that and their voting patterns. And I did want to say one thing about the Pew study, the religious landscape study. They do them every 7 years, and they just came up with the latest one. And their spin was, the decline of Christianity stabilizing, which I thought was the wrong spin. Like they're very uncomfortable with the fact that religion is a little bit on the wane. 62% of people now identify as Christian, compared to, was it 94% or something in 2007? But I thought that the real takeaway was that 29% of Americans are nuns, religiously unaffiliated. But the other takeaway is that although they only said about 5% of the nuns are atheists and 4% are agnostic, and the rest just have no preference or whatever, when they actually asked the American people, the survey, do you believe in God? 17% said no. Well, the definition of an atheist is somebody who doesn't believe in God. So these are people who are uncomfortable with the definition. They don't call themselves that, but they are. I mean, that shows 72% of U.S. adult Americans do not believe in God. So it's the level of free thought atheism is really much higher, I think, than we think of.
Thank you, everybody, for turning up for this. Remember, the flyers with a 30% discount are right on the projector now.
It's an excellent book. I have seen the manuscript ahead of time.